They'll tell you that knowledge makes you more understanding, more patient, more compassionate, more open to the full spectrum of human experience. And in some ways that's true, but it's only half the story. Because there's another side to genuine awakening that nobody puts on the motivational posters, nobody turns into an aesthetic quote for social media, and almost nobody warns you about before you start the journey. The real truth, the one that only makes sense after you've lived it, is that the more deeply you know yourself, the less you're willing to accept from others. Not because you become arrogant, not because you become cold, but because something inside you shifts permanently, like a bone that has been reset after years of growing crooked. And once it's set correctly, you simply cannot go back to the positions that used to feel normal. What used to feel like love starts to feel like performance. What used to feel like connection starts to feel like transaction. What used to feel like loyalty starts to feel like fear, and the life you once called fulfilling starts to look, in the clear light of self-awareness, like a very comfortable cage. Here's the paradox at the heart of this entire conversation. The more conscious you become, the more alone you may feel at first. Because consciousness is not a group activity. Most people are not doing this work. Most people are still running the old programs, still wearing the old masks, still mistaking intensity for love and compliance for peace. And when you start to wake up, you don't just see yourself more clearly, you start to see everyone else more clearly too. You see the dynamics for what they are. You see the patterns beneath the surface. You see the gap between what people say and what they actually do. And that clarity, as liberating as it is, can feel profoundly isolating, because you can no longer unsee what you've seen. You can no longer unknow what you know. And pretending, which used to be so easy, becomes almost physically impossible. But here's what makes all of it worth it, and this is the part that will only make complete sense by the end of this video. On the other side of that isolation is not loneliness. It's freedom. And on the other side of that freedom is the possibility of the most real, most grounded, most genuinely nourishing connections you have ever experienced in your life. There's something nobody warns you about before life starts asking too much of you. Before the burnout, before the resentment, before the moment you look in the mirror and feel like a stranger, there was a deal. Not the kind written on paper, not the kind anyone shakes hands over. It was quieter than that. It happened in small rooms, at dinner tables, in classrooms, in relationships where belonging felt like a matter of survival. Somewhere along the way, you learned that being fully yourself came with a cost. And so, without even realizing it, you started paying. You laughed at jokes that didn't sit right with you. You swallowed opinions that deserved to be spoken. You made yourself smaller, softer, more agreeable, not because you wanted to, but because something deep inside told you that love was conditional and conditions had to be met. That's where it all begins. Not in some dramatic crisis, but in the quiet, everyday erosion of your own truth. The spiritual teachers who've walked through fire will tell you the same thing. The most dangerous contracts are the ones you never signed consciously. The soul doesn't negotiate through logic. It negotiates through fear. And when a child, or even a grown adult, senses that authenticity might cost them connection, the ego steps in as a protector. It says, just adapt, just this once, and then once becomes always. Carl Jung spent his life studying this exact mechanism, the way human beings construct layers of personality not out of freedom, but out of necessity. He called it the persona, the social mask. But long before it has a name, it already has a weight. Every time you bent your inner world to fit someone else's expectations, you were making a withdrawal from an account you didn't know was running low. Your energy, your clarity, your sense of self, and the transaction felt so normal that you started calling it maturity. You called it being reasonable. You called it love. But real spiritual growth has never asked you to disappear for someone else's comfort. What's fascinating and heartbreaking is how invisible this cost remains for so long. Think about someone who always says yes at work, not because they want to, but because they're terrified of being seen as difficult. Or the friend who laughs off being treated poorly, because keeping the peace feels safer than speaking up. Or the partner who rewrites their own needs in every relationship, convincing themselves that this is just what love requires. These aren't rare personalities. These are people running an unconscious program, one written in childhood, reinforced by culture, and mistaken for character. The inner work that changes everything doesn't start with a grand revelation. It starts with a single, uncomfortable question. How much of who I am right now was chosen by me, and how much was chosen for me by fear? Books like The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk or Codependent No More by Melody Beattie are powerful entry points into this kind of honest self-awareness. They don't flatter you, they show you the pattern, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. Here's what the awakening really looks like in its earliest form. It doesn't feel like enlightenment. It feels like exhaustion. It feels like a slow, creeping sense that something is off, that the version of you showing up in the world isn't the whole story. The higher self doesn't announce itself with thunder. It whispers first, through discomfort, through the moments when you catch yourself performing instead of living, through the quiet, nagging intuition that you've been shrinking for so long, you've forgotten your actual size. That whisper is not a crisis. It's an invitation. And what it's asking is not for you to blow up your life or condemn the people who shaped you. It's asking for something far more subtle and far more powerful: honesty. Because the transformation doesn't begin when the world changes. It begins when you stop pretending the cost was worth it and start wondering what it would feel like to stop paying altogether. Nobody talks about the kind of tired that doesn't go away after a good night's sleep. The world is full of conversations about burnout, about stress, about mental health, but most of them miss the deepest layer of it. Because the exhaustion that truly breaks a person open isn't the kind that comes from working too hard or sleeping too little. It's the kind that comes from performing, from waking up every single day and putting on a version of yourself that was built for someone else's approval. It's the tiredness of being fluent in a language that was never really yours. And the insidious thing about this kind of fatigue is that it hides behind functionality. The person carrying it still shows up, still answers emails, still laughs at the right moments, still holds it together in public. From the outside, everything looks fine. But on the inside, something is quietly running out of fuel, and that something is the soul. There's a specific moment that many people who've done deep inner work can point to. Not a breakdown, not a dramatic scene, but a small, ordinary instant where the mask slipped just enough to let the truth breathe. Maybe it was driving home after a gathering where they smiled all evening and felt completely alone. Maybe it was in the middle of saying, "I'm fine," and suddenly, for a split second, not believing it. Maybe it was watching someone else cry about something that should have made them cry too, and feeling nothing, because they'd been numb for so long. They'd mistaken numbness for strength. That moment isn't the bottom. It's actually the beginning. Spiritual growth rarely starts with a mountaintop experience. It starts in those thin cracks where the light gets in, where your consciousness, even for just a second, wakes up and says, "This isn't sustainable." And that quiet, exhausted honesty is more sacred than any forced positivity you could plaster over it. What makes this stage so delicate is that the people around you often can't see it, and worse, they may not want to. Because you've been reliable. You've been the strong one, the stable one, the one who holds things together. Your emotional intelligence has been a gift to everyone else, while your own inner world went unattended. Think about the friend who's always available for everyone's crisis, but never allows themselves to have one. Or the partner who intuitively knows how to regulate the other person's emotions while quietly drowning in their own. Or the professional who channels every ounce of their energy into their work. Because the structure of productivity feels safer than sitting still with themselves. These aren't signs of weakness. They're signs of a person who learned, very early on, that their needs were either too much or not important enough. The healing begins not when you finally explode, but when you finally admit, even just to yourself, that you are tired, that the vibration you've been holding isn't yours, and that something has to change. The most courageous thing a person can do at this stage isn't to leave a relationship, quit a job, or make some sweeping external change. The most courageous thing is to sit in the silence and let the exhaustion speak. To stop distracting, stop performing, stop explaining away the discomfort, and just listen. Because that tiredness is not your enemy. It's actually the most honest part of you, knocking from the inside, asking to be let out. Practices like journaling, not the gratitude list kind, but the raw, unfiltered kind where you write what you'd never say out loud, can be transformative at this point. So, can somatic work, like the kind described in Waking the Tiger by Peter Levine, which helps the body release what the mind has been holding. The point isn't to fix anything yet. The point is to finally feel what's real. Because you can't heal what you won't acknowledge. And you can't acknowledge what you're still too busy performing to notice. Something is waking up underneath all that noise, and it has a face you haven't seen in a very long time. At some point in the journey, a person stumbles upon one of the most unsettling discoveries the inner work has to offer, and it's not about someone else. It's about them. It's the moment they realize that the personality they've been living inside, the one they've been defending, explaining, and identifying with, wasn't entirely chosen. It was constructed, built piece by piece, not from freedom, but from feedback, from the reactions of parents, teachers, friends, lovers, from every environment that ever rewarded certain behaviors and punished others. Carl Jung gave this construction a name, the persona. And the word itself is revealing because in ancient Greek theater, a persona was quite literally a mask, the physical object actors held in front of their faces to play a role. The uncomfortable truth Jung spent his life pointing toward is that most human beings never realize they're still holding the mask. They've worn it for so long, pressed so tightly against the skin, that they've begun to believe the mask is the face, that the role is the self. And that belief, more than anything else, is what keeps a person spiritually asleep. Here's how it happens in real life, in ways most people recognize but rarely name. The child who was praised for being smart learns to perform intelligence, even at the cost of admitting confusion. The teenager who was loved for being funny learns to use humor as a shield, even when what they really feel is pain. The adult who was admired for being strong learns to present strength as their identity, even when they're collapsing on the inside. Each of these is a persona, a survival strategy that calcified into a character. And the truly tricky part is that these masks aren't entirely false. They contain real aspects of the person, but they're incomplete. They're the highlight reel of the self, carefully curated to maintain connection, approval, and safety. The shadow, everything that didn't make the cut, gets pushed underground. And what gets pushed underground doesn't disappear. It accumulates. It leaks out in moments of anger that seem disproportionate, in patterns of self-sabotage that make no logical sense, in the persistent feeling that something is missing even when everything looks fine from the outside. The awakening to this truth can feel deeply disorienting, and that disorientation is actually a sign that the process is working. Think about someone who built their entire identity around being the caretaker in every relationship, the one who nurtures, fixes, and holds space. That's a beautiful quality until they notice that they don't know how to receive. That asking for help feels almost physically uncomfortable, that their sense of worth is entirely tied to their usefulness. When that person begins doing real inner work, they don't just discover a pattern, they discover a prison. And for a while, standing at the door of that prison is terrifying, because the ego will argue fiercely, but this is who I am. If I stop being the caretaker, who am I? That question is not a sign of weakness. That question is the beginning of real consciousness. A deeply useful companion at this stage is Jung's own modern man in search of a soul, or, for a more accessible entry point, Owning Your Own Shadow by Robert A. Johnson, both of which guide the reader through exactly this kind of honest confrontation with the constructed self. What makes this discovery so spiritually significant is what it implies about freedom. Because if the person you've been presenting to the world was partially a performance, then there is something underneath it that was never performed, something prior to the conditioning, something that existed before the world started shaping you into what it needed you to be. The mystics called it the soul. The psychologists call it the authentic self. But whatever name you give it, the recognition of its existence changes everything. It means the story isn't over. It means the version of you that has been apologizing for taking up space, shrinking to fit, and bending to belong, that version isn't the final draft. It's a first draft written under pressure, and first drafts, by nature, are meant to be revised. The question that begins to form at the edges of awareness, quietly at first, then louder, is one that will eventually demand a real answer. If the people in your life have only ever known the mask, what happens when you finally take it off? There comes a moment in the journey of self-awareness that is equal parts clarifying and devastating. It doesn't arrive with a warning. It arrives quietly, in the aftermath of a boundary finally set, a need finally voiced, a role finally stepped out of. And what follows that moment reveals something about the relationships in a person's life that no amount of wishful thinking could have shown them before. People start to pull back. The texts slow down. The invitations stop coming. The warmth that felt so real begins to cool, and not because anything dramatic happened, but simply because the dynamic shifted. Because the person who used to absorb, give, fix, and accommodate without asking for much in return suddenly started taking up space in a different way. And in that shift, a painful but necessary truth surfaces. Some of what they called connection was never really connection at all. It was access. It was the comfort of having someone reliably available, reliably selfless, reliably easy. And when that reliability changed, so did the relationship, because the relationship had been built on a function, not a foundation. This is one of the most spiritually significant tests a person will ever face, precisely because it hits at the deepest human fear, the fear of abandonment, of the ego, still running its old programming, will interpret this disappearance as confirmation of its worst belief. See, I was right to keep giving everything, because the moment I stopped, they left. But consciousness, slowly stretching its wings, offers a different interpretation. The ones who left were never really here for you. They were here for what you provided. And that distinction, as painful as it is one of the most liberating pieces of discernment a person can develop. Because it doesn't mean people are evil. It doesn't mean relationships are traps. It means that some connections were transactional by nature, and both people were playing a role in a dynamic that was never truly equal. Seeing that clearly, without bitterness, without victimhood, is a sign of real emotional maturity. It's the moment the soul stops negotiating its worth in exchange for presence. What's particularly revealing about this phase is the contrast it creates, because while some people fade when the dynamic changes, others don't. Some people lean in. Some people get curious. Some people, for the first time, show up in a fuller way, because now there's space for a real exchange, not just a one-sided transaction. And that contrast is the gift hidden inside the grief. It becomes a living map of the relationships worth investing in. Think about someone who spent years being the emotional anchor of their friend group. Always available, always supportive, always the one who held the space. The moment they go through something hard and need that same energy returned, the group fractures. Some friends show up beautifully. Others go strangely quiet. That fracture isn't a failure, it's information. It's the relationship revealing its own architecture. And while it hurts, it also clears the field. It removes the noise so the signal, the real connections, the ones built on genuine resonance, can finally be heard. Here's what the inner work teaches about this, slowly and sometimes painfully. You cannot build authentic intimacy on top of a performance. If people fell in love with the mask, with the always available, never needy, infinitely giving version of you, then they haven't actually met you yet. And you deserve to be met. Not the curated version, not the functional version, not the version that exists to make everyone else comfortable, but the actual, complicated, beautifully imperfect human being underneath all of that. The spiritual truth at the heart of this topic is that real connection requires two whole people, not one whole person and one person pretending to be fine. When you stop being useful as a performance and start simply being present as yourself, you will lose some people. That loss is real, and it deserves to be grieved. But what grows in the space they leave behind is something most people have never actually experienced. Relationships where you are chosen, not consumed. And somewhere in the background of all this clarity, a new and uncomfortable question begins to form. If I was so focused on what others were taking from me, what was I refusing to look at in myself? There's a conversation that happens in almost every honest therapy session, every deep journal entry, every late-night moment of raw self-reflection, and it goes something like this. I swore I would never be like that. I swore I would never end up here again. And yet, here they are, a different face, a different city, a different chapter, but somehow the same emotional landscape. The same arguments, the same dynamic, the same specific flavor of pain that feels almost familiar, like a song they know every word to even though they wish they'd never learned it. This is one of the most humbling and most important discoveries on the path of spiritual growth. The recognition that the unconscious mind is not random. It has a logic. And that logic, left unexamined, will recreate the same experiences over and over again, not out of cruelty, but out of something far more primal. the drive to resolve what was never resolved, to finish the unfinished business of the past. The pattern isn't a punishment, it's a curriculum, and it will keep repeating until the lesson is finally learned. The science behind this is as fascinating as it is sobering. The nervous system, shaped by early experiences, doesn't just remember trauma intellectually, it encodes it somatically, in the body, in the reflexes, in the way a person breathes when they feel unsafe. And because the brain is fundamentally a prediction machine, it gravitates toward the familiar, even when the familiar is painful, because familiar is at least known. Predictable pain feels safer to the nervous system than unpredictable peace. This is why someone who grew up in emotional chaos will often, unconsciously, create or attract emotional chaos in adulthood. Not because they want to suffer, but because calm, real, sustained calm feels foreign, feels flat, feels like something must be wrong. The body doesn't trust it yet. Dr. Gabor Mate explores this with extraordinary depth in the Realm of Hungry Ghosts, and Bessel van der Kolk's The Body Keeps the Score maps the neuroscience of it in ways that will permanently change how a person understands their own behavior. And these aren't light reads, they're mirrors. And mirrors, at this stage of the journey, are exactly what's needed. Think about the person who grew up with an emotionally unavailable parent, someone who was physically present but emotionally distant, unpredictable in their warmth, inconsistent in their love. That child learned very early that love is something you earn through effort. That connection requires constant pursuit. That the moment you relax, the moment you stop trying, the warmth disappears. Now, fast forward 20 years. That same person finds themselves drawn again and again to partners who are emotionally unavailable, who run hot and cold, who require constant emotional labor to stay engaged. And every time they tell themselves, this one is different. But the pattern doesn't care about the face. The pattern cares about the feeling, that specific, charged, anxious kind of love that feels like home because it mirrors the original wound. Breaking this cycle doesn't happen through willpower alone. It happens through awareness, through the painful, courageous act of recognizing the pattern while you're inside it, not just in retrospect. The awakening to this truth is not comfortable, but it is deeply, profoundly freeing. Because the moment a person realizes the pattern is internal, not just external, they reclaim their power. If the problem were always the other person, the unavailable partner, the toxic friend, the difficult family member, then the solution would always be out of reach, dependent on someone else changing. But if the pattern lives inside, in the nervous system, in the unconscious choices and attractions, then the transformation is possible from the inside out. That's where the real inner work begins, not in analyzing others, but in sitting with the honest, uncomfortable question, what does this dynamic give me that I'm not willing to give myself? Practices like internal family systems therapy, somatic experiencing, or even consistent mindfulness meditation, as taught in Jon Kabat-Zinn's Full Catastrophe Living, can begin to rewire those deep responses over time. The pattern loses its grip not when life gets easier, but when the self becomes more conscious. And as that consciousness expands, something strange and unexpected starts to emerge. A new sensitivity to everything that feels off. A sharper, almost uncomfortable awareness of the things in others that you've been quietly refusing to see in yourself. There's a particular kind of irritation that deserves a closer look, not the ordinary frustration of a bad day or a difficult situation, but the disproportionate kind. The kind that flares up too fast, burns too hot, and lingers too long for the offense to justify it. Most people, when they feel it, point outward. They describe the other person in vivid detail, their arrogance, their neediness, their dishonesty, their selfishness. And they're not entirely wrong. The other person may genuinely have those qualities. But what the inner work eventually reveals is that the intensity of the reaction, that specific charge, that particular heat, is rarely just about the other person. It's a signal, a transmission from the unconscious, pointing not outward but inward. Carl Jung called this the shadow, the repository of everything a person has rejected, suppressed, or refused to integrate about themselves. Not because those qualities are necessarily evil, but because at some point they felt too dangerous, too shameful, or too unacceptable to claim. And so they went underground. But underground doesn't mean gone. It means hidden and projected with startling accuracy onto the people who trigger us most. Jung said it plainly. Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. And once you really sit with that idea, not as a clever quote, but as a living principle, it changes the way you move through every relationship. The person who explodes with contempt at someone they perceive as arrogant might be carrying an unexpressed need for recognition that they've been taught to call vanity. The person who can't stand neediness in others might be someone who learned very early that having needs was a burden and has been punishing themselves for having them ever since. The person who condemns dishonesty in others with unusual ferocity might be someone sitting on a truth they haven't been brave enough to tell. None of this is comfortable to consider. The ego resists it fiercely because the whole point of projection is to keep the shadow invisible, to outsource the discomfort rather than own it. But consciousness doesn't grow in the comfortable. It grows in the honest. Here's a practice that can genuinely shift something in a person willing to try it, and it requires nothing more than a journal and a willingness to be uncomfortable. Write down the name of someone who irritates you deeply. Then write, in as much detail as possible, exactly what it is about them that bothers you. Don't filter it. Don't be polite. Let it be raw. Then, and this is the part most people resist, ask yourself, where does this quality live in me? Not in the same form, perhaps. The shadow rarely presents itself as an exact mirror, but somewhere, in some shape, the seed of what you're condemning is present. Maybe the person you call manipulative learned to manipulate for the same reason you learned to people please, because direct expression felt unsafe. Maybe the person you call emotionally unavailable built their walls for the same reasons you built yours, just using different bricks. This kind of shadow work, explored brilliantly in Meeting the Shadow, edited by Connie Zweig and Jeremiah Abrams, is not about excusing behavior. It's about reclaiming the energy that's been locked up in judgment and redirecting it toward genuine self-awareness and transformation. What shifts when a person begins doing this work consistently is almost alchemical. The disproportionate reactions start to lose their charge. The triggers become teachers instead of tormentors. And something even more remarkable happens. Compassion becomes available in places where only irritation used to live. Not the performed kind of compassion, not the spiritual bypassing that says, I forgive everyone for everything, without actually feeling it, but real, grounded, earned compassion. The kind that comes from recognizing your own shadow in someone else's behavior and thinking quietly, I know what that costs a person. This is where the concept of projection stops being a psychological theory and becomes a lived spiritual practice. Because every time you retrieve a projection, every time you say, that thing I hate in you is something I haven't yet made peace with in myself, you become a little freer, a little less reactive, a little more whole. And as the shadow integrates, something profound begins to happen in the way you see yourself. Because the harshest critic in the room, it turns out, was never the people around you. And the most important question you've been avoiding isn't about them at all. It's about you and why you accepted, for so long, so much less than you deserved. This is the topic most people arrive at last and resist the hardest. Because everything that came before it, as difficult as it was, still allowed a comfortable degree of focus on the external. The patterns, the projections, the disappearing people, the masks, all of it, in some way, could still be framed as something that happened to you, something that was done, shaped, or imposed from the outside. But this topic doesn't allow that. This one turns the lens completely inward and asks the question that is simultaneously the most difficult and the most liberating a person can face on the path of genuine spiritual growth. Why did I allow it? Not as an accusation, not as self-blame dressed up in spiritual language, but as an honest, courageous, deeply necessary inquiry into the internal architecture that made tolerance of the intolerable feel not just acceptable, but familiar, even safe. Because the truth is, nobody stays in dynamics that don't serve them purely by accident. There is always an internal logic, always a belief running quietly in the background, just beneath the surface of consciousness, that made the math add up, even when the math was clearly wrong. The beliefs that keep people in diminishing dynamics are rarely dramatic. They don't announce themselves. They whisper. If I ask for more, I'll lose them. People who really love don't need much. I should be grateful for what I have. Maybe I'm the problem. These aren't random thoughts. They're conclusions drawn from early experiences, calcified over time into what feel like facts about reality. A person who grew up receiving love inconsistently learns, at a cellular level, that love is scarce and must be preserved at any cost, including the cost of their own dignity. A person who was made to feel like a burden learns to preemptively shrink, to ask for less, to be grateful for crumbs, because crumbs feel like more than they expected. These are not character flaws. They are adaptations, brilliant, creative, desperate adaptations made by a younger version of the self in an environment that offered limited options. The problem is that those adaptations don't automatically update when the environment changes. They keep running like outdated software long after the original threat has passed. Here's where the real turning point lives, not in recognizing what others did, but in recognizing what you kept choosing and why. Think about someone who stayed in a friendship where they were consistently belittled, overlooked, and taken for granted. From the outside, the question seems simple. Why didn't they just leave? But from the inside, the answer is layered and deeply human. Leaving would mean admitting the relationship was never what they believed it to be, and that admission carries grief. Staying, even in pain, preserved the story. It preserved the hope. And hope, even distorted hope, feels better than mourning. This is why awareness alone is rarely enough to break the pattern. The inner work at this stage requires something more specific. The willingness to grieve the version of the relationship or the version of the person that you needed them to be, rather than who they actually were. Therapists like Terry Real, whose work in Us, Getting Past You and Me to Build a More Loving Relationship, deals directly with relational blind spots, or Thich Nhat Hanh's Reconciliation, which approaches healing through radical self-compassion, offer profound guidance for exactly this kind of internal reckoning. What makes this stage the true turning point of the entire journey is what it does to personal power. Because the moment a person stops asking, why did they treat me that way, and starts asking, what in me decided that was acceptable, the locus of control shifts entirely. Not in a way that erases accountability for what others did, but in a way that reclaims agency over what happens next. That shift is the difference between a person who heals and a person who simply accumulates more grievances. It's the difference between clarity and bitterness. And it requires a quality that is far rarer and far more valuable than intelligence or resilience. It requires honesty. The raw, undefended, ego-dissolving kind of honesty that looks at the full picture and says, I participated in this. I don't know why yet, but I'm willing to find out. That willingness is the seed of everything that follows. Because what grows from it isn't shame, it's sovereignty. And sovereignty, once tasted, makes the next discovery both inevitable and quietly devastating. Because healing, it turns out, is not just about what you gain. It's about what and who you have to be willing to lose. Nobody tells you that healing has a funeral, that somewhere inside the process of becoming more whole, more conscious, more authentically yourself, there is a mourning, a real, legitimate, sometimes overwhelming grief for the identities that carried you this far, but can no longer come with you. The patient one, the one who never complained, the one who always had it together, the one who smiled through everything. These weren't just roles, they were survival strategies that became self-concepts, that became personalities, that became the very way you understood your own existence. And when the inner work begins to dissolve them, when consciousness starts to see through the construction, the ego doesn't simply step aside and applaud. It grieves. It protests. It asks, with genuine desperation, if I'm not the strong one, if I'm not the reliable one, if I'm not the one who holds everything together, then who am I? And for a while, that question doesn't have a clean answer. For a while, there is just the in-between, the uncomfortable, disorienting, necessary space between who you were trained to be and who you are actually becoming. This grief is misunderstood by almost everyone who hasn't lived it from the inside. From the outside, a person in this stage of transformation can look like they're falling apart, withdrawing from relationships, questioning long-held beliefs, losing enthusiasm for things that used to define them. And well-meaning people around them will often try to fix it. They'll offer encouragement, suggest distractions, remind them of everything they have to be grateful for. But what they don't understand is that this isn't a malfunction. This is the process working exactly as it should. In almost every genuine spiritual tradition, this phase has a name and a place of honor. The mystics called it the dark night of the soul. The psychologists call it an identity crisis. But what it really is, stripped of all the labels, is a person being honest enough to stop performing a self that no longer fits, and brave enough to sit in the uncertainty of not yet knowing what comes next. That sitting, uncomfortable as it is not regression. It is paradoxically the most profound form of forward movement available. What makes this grief particularly complex is that it isn't just about losing false identities. It's often about losing the people who were attached to those identities. The friend group that loved you when you were the funny, easygoing one who never made things heavy. The family dynamic that worked perfectly as long as you played your assigned role. The relationship that thrived on your willingness to minimize yourself. When you begin to change, genuinely, structurally change, some of those connections cannot follow. Not because either party is a villain, but because the dynamic was built around a version of you that no longer exists. And grieving that is not the same as regretting the growth. It's honoring the real cost of it. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, whose framework for grief extends far beyond physical death into any significant loss of identity, offers a useful map here. So does Francis Weller's extraordinary The Wild Edge of Sorrow, which treats grief not as a problem to be solved, but as a sacred passage to be moved through, with honesty, with community when possible, and above all, with compassion for the self that carried so much for so long. Here is what the other side of this grief looks like, not as a promise, but as a testimony from everyone who has walked through it honestly. It gets lighter, not immediately, not linearly, but gradually the identity that was built from fear begins to compost into something richer. The neediness to be seen as strong gives way to the genuine experience of strength, the kind that doesn't require an audience. The compulsion to be needed gives way to the freedom of simply being present. The performance of okayness gives way to the actual experience of peace, quiet, unannounced, and more solid than anything the performing self ever produced. And in that quieter space, something begins to emerge that is both deeply familiar and completely new, a version of the self that doesn't need to be anything in particular to feel worthy of love. That emergence is not the end of the journey. In many ways, it's the beginning of the real one. But before that piece can be fully trusted, there's one more illusion waiting to be examined, because what most people discover next is that even after all this work, the pull of chaos is stronger than they expected, and calm, real calm, feels stranger than it should. There's a specific kind of confusion that surfaces after a person has done genuine inner work, and it catches almost everyone off guard because it arrives exactly when things are supposed to be getting better. They've done the shadow work, they've grieved the old identities, they've set the boundaries, had the hard conversations, left the dynamics that were slowly draining them, and then they find themselves in something new, something calmer, more reciprocal, more genuinely caring, and instead of feeling relief, they feel strangely hollow. The connection feels too easy. The person feels too available. The relationship feels too quiet. And somewhere in the nervous system, an old alarm starts whispering, "This isn't real. This isn't love. Something must be missing." And that whisper, if not recognized for what it is, will sabotage more genuine connections than any external obstacle ever could. Because the truth that almost nobody prepares you for is this: if you were raised on emotional chaos, your nervous system learned to read intensity as love. And when real love finally arrives, steady, consistent, undramatic, it doesn't feel like arriving. It feels like settling. It feels like loss. The neuroscience of this is both humbling and clarifying. Relationships built on anxiety, unpredictability, and emotional volatility activate the brain's reward system in ways that are almost chemically identical to addiction. The highs are higher. The reconciliations feel more profound. The love, precisely because it is uncertain, feels more precious, the way anything scarce feels more valuable than something reliably available. Helen Fisher's research on romantic love and brain chemistry maps this with remarkable precision, showing how the same neural pathways activated by cocaine are activated by obsessive, anxious attachment. Which means that, for someone whose early blueprint for love was built on inconsistency, on a parent who was sometimes warm and sometimes distant, on a relationship where affection had to be earned and could be withdrawn at any moment, the neurological experience of healthy love genuinely feels different. flatter, less alive. And the ego, still running its old programming, interprets that flatness not as safety, but as absence, not as peace, but as boredom, not as real connection, but as incompatibility. This is where discernment becomes one of the most critical spiritual practices available. Because the work at this stage is not about choosing between passion and peace. It's about learning to distinguish between the two in real time from the inside. Think about someone who has just left a relationship defined by intensity, constant push and pull, passionate fights followed by passionate reconciliations, a feeling of being completely alive precisely because they never felt completely secure. Now they meet someone who is consistent, who shows up when they say they will, who communicates clearly and doesn't play games. And instead of feeling grateful, they feel underwhelmed. Now they find themselves manufacturing drama, testing the person's commitment, pulling back just to see if they'll be chased. Not out of malice, out of a nervous system that genuinely doesn't know how to metabolize steadiness. Books like Attached by Amir Levine and Rachel Heller offer an extraordinarily practical framework for understanding these attachment dynamics, while Getting the Love You Want by Harville Hendrix goes deeper into why we unconsciously seek partners who recreate our earliest emotional environment, even when that environment was painful. The healing available at this stage is subtle but profound, and it happens not through analysis alone, but through repetition, through the slow, patient, sometimes uncomfortable experience of staying in the calm long enough for the nervous system to learn that it's safe, that the absence of chaos is not the absence of love, that consistency is not the same as stagnancy, that a person who doesn't make you anxious is not a person you've settled for. They're a person you've finally become available to receive. This shift doesn't happen overnight. It happens in small moments, in noticing the urge to create distance and choosing presence instead, in sitting with the discomfort of being truly seen without immediately deflecting, in allowing someone to be kind to you without immediately looking for the catch. Each of those moments is a reprogramming. Each one tells the nervous system something it may have never heard before. You are allowed to be at peace. You are allowed to be loved without earning it. You are allowed to stay. And as that truth settles, slowly, tentatively, but unmistakably, something begins to shift in the quality of the silence around a person. A silence that, for the first time in a long time, doesn't feel like something to be afraid of. There is a version of solitude that most people spend their entire lives running from, filling every quiet moment with noise, every empty evening with plans, every pause in conversation with something, anything, to avoid sitting alone with themselves. And it makes sense because for a long time, silence was not neutral. It was where the unprocessed things lived, the grief that hadn't been felt, the questions that hadn't been answered, the versions of the self that hadn't been integrated. Silence, for someone still carrying all of that, is not peaceful. It's loud in the worst possible way. It amplifies everything that has been carefully avoided. And so the running continues, not out of laziness or shallowness, but out of a very reasonable self-protection instinct. The person doesn't know yet that what waits in the silence isn't a threat. They don't know yet that the stillness they've been fleeing is actually the place where the deepest healing lives. They haven't yet discovered what becomes available on the other side of the fear, because they've never stayed long enough to find out. But something changes after the work has been done, after the patterns have been named, the shadows have been examined, the grief has been moved through, the identities have been released. The silence starts to feel different. It stops being an absence and starts being a presence. Not the eerie, uncomfortable presence of unprocessed pain, but something warmer, more grounded, more spacious. The mystics across every tradition have pointed toward this experience with different words but the same essential gesture. Thomas Merton called it contemplative prayer. The Zen tradition calls it the ground of being. The Sufi poets called it the beloved within. But, stripped of all the spiritual vocabulary, what they're all describing is the same thing: a person who has become comfortable enough with themselves that their own company is no longer a source of anxiety, who can sit in a quiet room without needing it to be filled, who can be alone without feeling lonely because they've discovered that solitude and loneliness are not the same thing at all. Loneliness is the pain of unwanted disconnection. Solitude is the freedom of chosen presence, with oneself, with the moment, with life exactly as it is. This arrival doesn't look dramatic from the outside, and that's part of what makes it so easy to underestimate. There's no lightning bolt, no mountaintop revelation. It looks like someone sitting with their morning coffee without reaching for their phone. It looks like an evening spent alone that ends with the quiet thought, "That was enough." It looks like a difficult conversation that, instead of sending the nervous system into a spiral, is metabolized with relative steadiness. It looks like making a decision from a place of genuine clarity rather than fear-driven urgency. These are small moments, but they are not small changes. They represent an entire reorganization of the inner world, from a system run by anxiety, performance, and the constant need for external validation, to one that is increasingly guided by intuition, authenticity, and the quiet authority of a person who has done the work and earned their own trust. Rainer Maria Rilke captured something essential about this when he wrote about learning to love the questions themselves, to live inside the uncertainty without demanding premature resolution. That capacity to be at peace with not knowing is one of the most sophisticated forms of emotional maturity available to a human being. And here's the truth that this entire journey has been building toward, the one that the first 9 topics were all quietly pointing at, from different angles, with different vocabulary. De-romanticizing humanity doesn't mean becoming cynical. It doesn't mean closing off, building higher walls, or deciding that people are ultimately disappointing. It means something far more nuanced and far more powerful. It means seeing people clearly with their contradictions, their wounds, their unconscious patterns, their beautiful and infuriating imperfections, and choosing to remain open anyway. Not naively, not desperately, but from a place of genuine discernment, grounded in self-awareness and self-respect. The person who has walked through all of this arrives at relationships differently. They are harder to manipulate, not because they are guarded, but because they know themselves. They are harder to lose, not because they cling, but because they are no longer willing to abandon themselves to keep someone else. And they are more capable of real love than ever before. Not the love that needs the other person to be perfect. Not the love that is actually fear wearing a romantic costume, but the love that sees fully, accepts honestly, and stays freely. That love begins not when you find the right person, but when you finally, after all of this, become available to be one. So, here you are. You've traveled through 10 of the most honest, most uncomfortable, and most important territories a human being can explore. You've looked at the contracts you never consciously signed. You've sat with the exhaustion that was trying to tell you something for years. You've seen the mask for what it was, watched relationships reveal their true architecture, traced the patterns back to their roots, retrieved projections from the people who triggered you most. Ask the hardest question of all. Why did I allow it? Grieve the identities that carried you but couldn't follow you. Learn to distrust the chaos you once called passion. And finally, arrived at a silence that doesn't frighten you anymore. That is not a small journey. That is the journey. The one most people spend their entire lives circling around, but never fully entering. Because it requires the one thing that is simultaneously the most simple and the most rare. The willingness to be completely honest with yourself, even when the truth is inconvenient, even when it costs you something, even when it means letting go of a version of yourself you worked very hard to build. But reading about this journey and actually living it are two entirely different things. And this is the moment where the real work begins, not on a screen, not in a video, but in your actual life, in the next conversation where you feel the familiar urge to shrink, in the next relationship where intensity starts masquerading as love, in the next quiet evening where the silence asks you to stay instead of reach for distraction, in the next moment where someone tests your boundary and part of you wants to fold, and another part of you, the part that has been waking up through all of this, holds steady. That's where the transformation lives. Not in the understanding of these concepts, but in the application of them, one small, courageous choice at a time. So ask yourself honestly and take a real moment with this. Don't just scroll past it. Which of these 10 topics hit closest to home? Which one made you pause, reread, or feel something shift in your chest? Because that's not a coincidence. That's your inner world, pointing you toward exactly where your work is waiting. And here's the question that might be the most provocative of all, the one worth sitting with long after this video ends. What would your life actually look like if you stopped tolerating what you've been tolerating? Not as a fantasy, not as a dramatic exit from everything, but as a real, grounded daily practice of choosing yourself, your actual self, not the performed version, in the small decisions that accumulate into a life. What relationships would shift? What conversations would you finally have? What would you stop explaining, stop justifying, stop contorting yourself to maintain? Because the version of you that exists on the other side of that question is not a stranger. It's not some distant, idealized future self. It's the person you already are, underneath everything that was built on top of them. And they've been waiting, patiently and without judgment, for you to come home. If this content moved something in you, if it gave language to something you've been feeling but couldn't quite name, then you already know that this kind of conversation is rare. Most content will tell you what you want to hear. This channel is committed to telling you what you need to hear, with honesty, with depth, and with genuine respect for your capacity to grow. So, if you're not subscribed yet, do it now, not as a favor to us, but as a commitment to yourself. Because every week, we go deeper. Every week, we bring you the kind of content that doesn't just pass the time. It changes the way you see yourself and the world around you. Hit the notification bell so you never miss a conversation that might be exactly the one you needed on exactly the right day. The journey continues, and the best of it is still ahead.